Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by the fine people at CACI, Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, God help me, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
You probably remember one of our listeners, Marcus from South Africa.
Indeed I do.
From time to time, we do Zoom calls we just put out a notice that we're going to be on Zoom and people join us, and we've had anywhere from half a dozen to 20 or 30 people show up. And one time, this young man joins us, and it comes out that he's in South Africa, and I'm doing the math, and of course, we were holding this at like 8 or 9 o'clock at night Eastern time, and we said, oh my God.
Like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning for Marcus.
Yeah. Marcus stayed up to the wee hours of the morning to talk with us. But Marcus has sent a comment following our episode on the rich paying their fair share. And he says, just for context, South Africa has one of the most progressive income taxes in the world. If you do the math, it works out that only 2.6% of the population pays over 76% of all income taxes. Now, I'm going to pause here for a minute. I'll come back to Marcus in a second. But I just went and looked up again the numbers for the United States, and I can't find a number for 2.6, but the top 3% in the U.S. are paying around 50%. So 2.6% in South Africa paying 76%, 3% in the U.S. paying 50%. So it's much more progressive than we have here. But Marcus goes on to say, and this is, I think, the interesting part, the South African Revenue Service, our equivalent of your IRS, warns that the government is becoming overly dependent upon an ever-shrinking pool of high-income earners. I've said this about California. California, amongst all the states, probably has the most progressive income tax system.
And this has been happening in places like Connecticut and New York. And now what are they finding? They're finding that people are leaving.
Well, yes, people are leaving, but particularly in California's case, I went back and looked up their tax revenues over the past 10 years, and they fluctuate wildly, like up or down, plus or minus 10 to 15%, one year to the next. And that's following the fortunes or the entrance and leavings of high-income individuals. So the more progressive you get, the more your fortunes depend on a small group of people.
And imagine the problem in California where many, I hesitate to say most, but much of the high end in California is in the tech industry.
Right.
And their fortunes rise and fall in lockstep.
Yeah.
All of the rich people have a bad year. Guess what happens to your tax base?
Yeah. And when you talk about people leaving the state for better tax environs, who's most able to do that are the rich.
That's exactly right. So, and Connecticut, my home state where I was born and raised, is facing this. They've become incredibly expensive. The cost of living in Connecticut is extraordinarily high. And it's not exactly the rich, although the rich are in fact leaving, but retirees, they pack up and leave immediately.
Yeah.
The day they retire, they're gone. And you can see why that would be, but imagine the impact that's going to have on the state's economy.
You know, the weird thing is, as children, we've all heard the story of the goose that laid the golden egg, and of course the moral of the story is don't kill the goose. And yet as adults, that seems to go right over our heads.
Yeah, but you know, the southern states haven't killed the goose. They're welcoming the goose.
Right,
There's a new place for the goose to live, new food for the goose to eat.
That's right.
Everything seems to be working out just fine for them. You hesitate to turn it into a partisan issue, but it is in no small part a partisan issue. The states that are most heavily Democratic are the states that are facing this sort of problem.
Yep.
Well, you know, one-party rule does this sort of thing. We've said this countless times here. Anyway, at the risk of breaking the fourth wall here and letting the people in on how we do our business when recording Words and Numbers, do you have any idea when this recording is going to go live?
This one?
Yeah, just a ballpark.
I'm guessing ballpark Jan 15.
I kind of figured that that was the case. And guess what's going to happen round about January 15th?
Oh,
the 14th to be exact.
Are you talking about the debt ceiling?
Indeed I am. Because having just, and I mean just, raised the debt ceiling not more than a couple of weeks prior to this recording, we are going to run out of gas mid-January.
Yep.
By the time the people are hearing this, it will already be on the evening news.
Yep, and we've said this before. I hate to sound like a broken record, except when it comes to debt ceiling, it's Congress that's a broken record. They hit the debt ceiling on average every 9 months and have been doing so since the 1970s. In my opinion, it's all smoke and mirrors. It's an opportunity for them to drag whatever pet projects, issues they have out in front of the media by saying the sky is falling, and the media pays attention because, oh my God, what's going to happen if the government goes bankrupt? The government's going to do the same thing it's done every 9 months for the past 50 years. Raise the debt ceiling.
And I'm here to make a bold prediction, Ant. Given the new administration coming in mid-January, and given that this whole Doge business is taking root, and we're going to root out all kinds of government inefficiencies, my prediction is that absolutely nothing will change. I'm going to want to hear from all the partisan hacks who are telling me that Trump will solve all of our problems. I want to hear from them a year from now when we're, probably at 42 trillion in debt, maybe 45?
Look, I have no doubt that Trump is going to find things to cut, and he may find some really useful things to cut. Granted, but he's going to also find things to spend more money on. And when all the dust settles, we're going to be back where we started.
And he will find that when he finds what he considers to be useful things to cut, the opposition to him is going to be enormous.
Oh, yes.
Because the American people love getting more stuff in return than they pay for.
Yep.
As long as that's true, and as long as there are human beings, that will be true. You will have to tell people they can't have what they want if you want to be responsible. And no politician is willing to tell the American people that what they want is unreasonable.
Which is really unfortunate, because of any politician in modern times, he seems perfectly suited to that. He can't run again. He's got nothing to lose.
And yet he won't do it.
I don't think he will either. What will happen, and if indeed this episode airs around January 15, I encourage people to look out the window. And if the government has shut down, what you will see are high visibility things. White House tours will be shut down. There'll be a cordon around the Washington Monument, and you're not allowed near it, right? The government will actually spend more money shutting down things that don't cost it that much, just so they can say, look at all the ways that we're cutting our budget because the spending has all been curtailed. Oh, and all of those government employees, every time that we've had a shutdown and they haven't been paid, when the government turns back on, they're paid retroactively.
That's right. As opposed to the real world, where if you get laid off and then you get brought back, you get a handshake and a welcome back.
Yeah.
You don't get repaid for the time you lost.
Yeah.
Right?
Why? Because you weren't working.
Because you weren't working. That's right. And if you look at government expenditures, what you find is that every time the government shuts down, expenditures go down, but they escalate the day it reopens, such that they might as well have not shut it down at all.
Yeah, it's a beautiful picture. I've drawn this thing several times. You see over time government spending rising as it does, and then it flatlines when you hit the debt ceiling. And then you can see when they raise the debt ceiling, because it rises vertically right up to where it would have been had the shutdown never occurred.
It's not a beautiful story, and it's a beautiful scam.
Right.
But this, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. And, we're just out of the Christmas season, and everybody's thinking about Christmas things. And this is equally true of our good friends in Texas. And you might recall that they had all kinds of problems when they decided to make their public schools more religious. Do you remember that?
I recall some to-do about putting the 10 Commandments in the schools.
And then the Church of Satan leapt to the challenge and said, well, if you're going to have that in the schools, you're going to have us too.
Right.
Causing a First Amendment problem, because churches is churches in the view of the First Amendment. Well, now there's a new religious problem in the great state of Texas, because there's a book that's being removed. And every time we talk about books being removed from schools, everybody loses their minds. But maybe this time it's even better than usual, because there's a Texas law that bans sexually explicit content in the school books.
Okay.
Of course, what book has more sexually explicit content than the Holy Bible, which has now been removed from all of the Texas schools?
Oh, my God. Wow.
It's the law of unintended consequences that you and I talk so much about. This is going to be a perfect chapter in our upcoming book on unintended consequences.
Yeah, but there's a potential silver lining here, because you start to talk about book banning, and I'm thinking in the back of my head, if you want to give some serious juice to a book promotion, get it banned somewhere. I would love if our book were banned.
Yeah, me too, but I don't think you have to promote the Bible in Texas.
Yeah, I would imagine not. Yeah.
It might be a wonder if more people read the thing.
Well, you never know. In Texas, there may be a large number of unchurched young teenage men who suddenly say, wait a minute, what have I been missing here?
This must be the coolest book ever. And, just if you're out there listening, young men in Texas, thumb your way to the Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs, depending on which edition you have, and start there.
God is not as stuffy as you might think.
No, and not nearly as. And earlier churchmen were way more interesting than modern churchmen.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. James, this week, this is your doing. You want to talk about Biden. I don't have much to offer here other than I'm appalled. As time goes by, it seems that for a longer and longer period of time, more and more people were aware that Biden was not able to assume the duties of president.
That is such a nice way of putting it. I might say that his brain had taken on the texture of pudding. This man had no business being near the halls of power. And yet there he was, sitting in the biggest, baddest chair in the world. I saw today somebody picking on Democrats, right, saying, you people are so keen to take guns away from regular Americans. Why didn't you take nuclear weapons away from President Biden?
Yeah.
Not a bad point, actually. I don't think memes really catch much on a day-to-day basis, but that one kind of caught a lot. And the more you think about that, the more right it gets. So what do we make of this? It's very clear. And look, everybody in the United States, indeed the world, saw what was going on in the Biden-Trump debate, where Joe Biden took the stage and just fumbled his way through everything. And that was when the dominoes started to fall, yielding a Kamala Harris presidential candidacy. But if we all saw it the night of the debate, when did everybody else on the interior notice? And why didn't they say anything? The 25th Amendment exists for exactly this sort of problem.
Okay, so hang on, because, of course, I have no idea, and we probably won't know for a long time how long he was out of the game. But I do recall...
No, we know already. People from inside are saying it's been well over 2 years.
Okay, because I was going to say, I recall early into his presidency, maybe 18 months, at the outside 2 years, I was seeing news articles in which op-ed writers were complaining that Biden's staff was not making him available to speak to the press.
And what did we find out in the past week? We found out that all of the press conferences that Biden had to work off cards that he was given ahead of time with the question and the answer already on the card.
Okay, James, 2 questions. First, we have a vice president for precisely this purpose. What was Harris doing during all this time? And second question, who was running the show?
Well, she was playing the role of a stalwart advocate. I mean, think back to when she was asked if there was anything that she would have done differently than Biden. And this was one of the pivotal moments in the campaign. She looked at the interviewer and said, I can't think of a single thing. Mm-hmm. Well, then why do you want to be president? I mean, what would you do differently? Are you just going to be a carbon copy of what we've had? And she at once wanted to say yes to that question in all of the forms that it took. And at the same time, say, no, I'm not Joe Biden, which she also said, but then could offer nothing of any substantive difference that she would do upon taking the office. She was in a bad spot. I don't want to take this out on her too terribly much. That said, she was probably the worst candidate I've ever seen. She was dreadful.
I don't know. I would take it out on her. As vice president, her constitutional duty is to the people. It's not to Joe Biden.
I understand, but she's between a rock and a hard place on that one. And I think, You said earlier that we're going to have to wait years and years to find out what happened. I think in one respect, that's absolutely true. And I think we're going to find out 20, 40 years down the road that a group headed by Kamala Harris told Joe Biden that they were going to execute the 25th Amendment if he didn't step down. I think we're going to find out that that happened because it's pretty clear Joe Biden didn't want to step down. He had to be given a situation in which there was literally no choice.
Okay, but that happened in year 4 of his presidency.
That's right.
What's going on at 18 months to 2 years in?
And we should say that happened in year 4 if it in fact happened.
Right, yeah.
Pure speculation on my part. But it's hard for me to imagine how he backs out without the sort of Damocles over his head. He had to have no choice whatsoever. But what about those first 3 years? Or maybe years 2, 3, and 4? And there were signs all over the place. How often was Biden able to meet with the press, even informally? Mm-hmm. And the answer was almost never. What did we see him doing? Stumbling around in public quite a lot, actually. Yep. Anybody who's lived with a family member suffering from dementia, I've said this before, we all knew exactly what we were looking at there. Mm-hmm. We'd seen it in our own homes. I had a parent die with dementia, I guess would be the best way of putting it. These signs are unmistakable. You don't miss them. And when it's the president of the United States, you have to keep him hidden or everybody will see.
Right.
Apparently they were canceling all kinds of public events if, quote, Joe was having a bad day, unquote. And anybody who's lived with a person with dementia knows this. There are very, very good days and very, very bad days. And you don't know which one you're going to get until you get them. And things were just canceled all around the president because of his mental condition. So there's the question, right? How many people had to be in bed with each other to keep this happening? And I think the answer is a metric ton.
Well, I read an article recently indicating that he wasn't even meeting regularly with his cabinet. So it may be a small number of people who are around him.
I think that's got to be right. But the obvious question is, where was the press? Because I understand how people inside the administration would have every interest in covering for him.
Right.
But where on earth was the press? We've got some history that we can learn from here. I think maybe starting with Woodrow Wilson. You want to keep it in roughly the modern era. But in 1919, Wilson had a stroke that completely incapacitated him, and he remained president until 1921. His wife became the de facto president of the United States. Regardless of what anybody says, she was the first female president of the United States. Okay, the press covered for them. The press covered for FDR endlessly. The press covered for John F. Kennedy. He had all kinds of back problems, something I am deeply sympathetic with, and took a lot of pain-killing medication, something I am also deeply familiar with. Do you want a person like that in control of the nuclear football? I don't know, maybe most of the time. Nixon, for his part, was a complete and total blackout drunk. Do you want him in control of the nuclear football? Not in the evenings, right? And yet we never heard about these things until way later in the game. Reagan's last 2 years, you didn't see much of him in public. Everybody, including him, he knew what was happening, right? So we seem to have a problem. It's the press's duty to report on these things. And yet they don't exactly do that. And what do we see? We see a press that has much the same interest in keeping an administration afloat as people inside the administration. Because what do they want? Access. What do they have? Access. Will they continue to have access if a new administration sweeps in? Maybe not. Well, if you're a self-interested human being, and all human beings are self-interested human beings, what are you going to do? Are you going to do your duty? Or are you going to do what's best for you and figure out a way to rationalize it as your duty? Everybody's deeply self-interested here.
Yeah, and I can see that with the press. What I'm having trouble getting my head around is Kamala Harris. She had to have known what was going on. She could have brought the cabinet together and had them invoke the 25th. And then she would have been president. And that would have paved the way for her subsequent election. It seems to me her incentives were to do the opposite of what she did do.
Well, maybe, but are you sure that a majority of the cabinet would have gone along with her?
I don't know. I mean, maybe 18 months in, no. But 3 years in, it was obvious to anybody who saw him in that, whatever that meeting was with the Japanese prime minister, where he couldn't manage to find his way off the stage.
Well, sure, but you're in the cabinet. Kamala Harris has to somehow convene you without Joe Biden finding out, which means everybody's got to stay quiet. What are the odds? The odds are zero.
Mm-hmm.
The odds are absolutely zero. Somebody's staff will tell a member of his staff that this is happening. So he's going to know right off the bat, or if that's irrelevant, given his mental condition, his staff will know. And then what are they going to do as they look at the cabinet? What are they going to say? What would you say to them? I mean, look, this takes on elements of the prisoner's dilemma almost immediately, right? All you have to do is start telling people what's going to happen to them if they try and fail.
Right.
If you try and fail, you'll all be fired.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to move forward then if you're a member of the cabinet? Mm. Or are you going to rationalize what you're looking at and say, well, we can run the show with Joe incapacitated. Hell, the more incapacitated he gets, the easier it might be. Because now you don't have to deal with a meddling president.
Okay, so let's pause here for a second. I was mentioning the 25th Amendment to somebody the other day and was surprised at the person's reaction. They had no idea that the cabinet could, I guess, remove the president's the wrong language to use here. But tell us a bit about 25th Amendment.
There are many, many things in the 25th Amendment that we don't have to care about. The one part we have to care about is where it addresses presidential disability, right? So imagine that the president has a stroke, or let's make it more obviously public. Let's imagine that the president is shot in the head and will never get better and yet is still president. Well, he's disabled. Mm-hmm. The Constitution is silent on this. So they added the 25th Amendment, which says that the vice president and a majority of the cabinet can declare the president disabled. And when they do, the vice president serves as acting president until the president can resume his duties. And if the president cannot resume his duties, well, so be it. And there's more that comes after. The only part we have to care about is that part, right? Where the vice president and a majority of the cabinet can say, all right, look, this isn't working and you can't be president right now. Mm-hmm. Now, that would be, I think, a tremendously sad day for the country, regardless of who it happened to. And yet, with people living longer and new and exciting diseases hitting us that never hit us before, given that we all died of something else long before these things happened, well, we're going to have contingency plans for these things. So what on earth do you do if a president is incapacitated but not dead?
Yeah.
You know, it's a brave new world for this sort of thing. And we keep electing old men to this office. This is going to keep on being a problem. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if it happened to become a problem in the next 4 years with Trump, who takes office the oldest incoming president we've ever had. He is an 81-year-old man taking office. Mm-hmm. Boy, that's old, right? I mean, that is well past retirement age. So what's going to happen? Hell, I don't know. But I think if you were laying odds, you'd have to take this into account.
Yeah. So we've got the 25th Amendment where the vice president with the majority of the cabinet can declare the president unfit. The next fail-safe, I assume, would be impeachment. The Congress can say he's now, of course, there's no crimes going on here, but my understanding is that the language around impeachment is so ill-defined, it doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't matter. Impeachment is literally whatever the House of Representatives says it is. It says high crimes and misdemeanors, but they get to define that any way they want. And then the Senate votes to convict or not. We've had presidents impeached twice, and the Senate has never removed those people from office. So it's a pretty high bar. Incidentally, the 25th Amendment sets an even higher bar for Congress to remove a president under the auspices of the 25th Amendment. So impeachment is going to be the easier of the ways to go. Would we ever use it for those reasons? I don't know. I think you'd have to take into account the partisan composition of the House and of the Senate and of the presidency. You know, what's going to happen there is one party rubbing their hands with glee to stick it to another party because their guy has become demented in office, maybe, right? And this, I think, brings us back to the role the press played in this last one. Press is overwhelmingly Democratic. Mm-hmm. There are very few Republicans in the press, and I think almost all of them work for Fox News in one capacity or another. The vast majority of all of the rest of every news outlet, maybe with the one, I mean, the Washington Times and the Wall Street Journal come to mind as right-leaning major news sources, but everything else leans heavily to the left. So you're going to get a fair amount of gatekeeping from the press, right? They are going to protect the left and skewer the right every chance they get. Not because they're bad people, but because they see the world that way. They honestly think they're doing a nice, impartial job, wherein they very clearly are not. People in the middle all know this, right? We all know that if you want something approaching the truth, you best stay away from Fox and MSNBC. We've said this before a million times. Does that leave CNN as the best option? God, I hope not, because that skews so hopelessly left, I don't even know what to say about it. And how do you know this? Watch the YouTube clips from when Trump won the White House either time. The clip shows that people have put together on Fox News, the various Fox News hosts, laughing and dancing in joy about what has happened, and people on the left on MSNBC and CNN literally weeping on air. Mm-hmm. Now, is that what an impartial press would do? Well, no, it's not. And people lose their minds about this and say the press should be impartial, to which I respond, well, maybe yes, but the press was never impartial in the United States until the early 20th century.
Right.
The press was highly partisan. As a matter of fact, most newspapers were overt arms of political parties. You know, why do you think the press should be nonpartisan? It may be beyond the ability of human beings to be nonpartisan.
In which case, the best you can do is try and get an equal number left and right in the seats in the White House press corps.
Yeah, or just encourage everybody to be as hyper-partisan as they want to be and let the American people sort it out from there. I think people are smart enough to do that. I think there's a big chunk of people who don't. That doesn't mean they're not smart enough. It means they don't care enough. And, you know, I think most people probably shouldn't even be voting, so woeful is their understanding of the world in which we live. But we all have the right to vote, and that's that, right? So you're going to vote. Let it be a big, nasty scrum.
So I was going to start off by saying, well, maybe the lesson we take from all this is that a president isn't all that important, that we've gone through at least 2 years with basically not having one. Except that there was nothing, how should I say? I don't want to say important, but you know what I mean. There were no wars going on that we were involved in. We weren't attacked during this period. What if that had happened? What happens then?
What if that had happened with any of the recent presidents we've had in the office? Do you feel that much better? Think where we started today. We started by talking about the debt limit. Well, these things just seem to happen regardless of who sits in the chair.
Yep.
And I opine then that no matter who has the chair next, we're going to be right back here next year at exactly this time, and it's going to be far worse than it is right now. There seems to be no difference. Well, when people talk about the deep state, they do it with great derision, and I do as well. But unlike them, I don't want government to keep right on doing what it always does. Will government continue to do exactly what it does regardless of who sits at the top? Yes, it absolutely will. How do I know? Well, we've had these times we can look at where that's exactly what's happened. And every time a president walks into the office saying, I'm going to change the mood in Washington, D.C., everything will be different after my presidency. 4 years later, what's that person say? I need 4 more years to make that happen. And then at the end, his successor says, now I need 4 years to make that happen. Why? Because it never happens. If you're not smart enough to realize that, I don't know what to tell you. Every 4 years, 2 groups of people come out of the woodwork and say, here's how we fix all of our problems. And then they tell us how they're going to fix Social Security and Medicare and the debt, et cetera, et cetera. 4 more years later after that, they all come out and they say the exact same because they didn't fix the problem.
Oh, yeah. Well, more than that, I would say they have an incentive not to fix it because so long as it isn't fixed, they can use it in the next election cycle.
And if it is fixed, then they have to be blameworthy. When somebody says, sure, you fix Social Security, but my grandma has $40 less a month to live on.
Right.
Et cetera, which is precisely what would have to happen for anybody to fix Social Security. And here's the newsflash. If you don't fix Social Security and Medicare, you will not fix the budget.
Yep.
Those are just massive expenses compared to everything else. So here we are.
Let's hit that a little harder. The Doge guys, Musk and Vivek, are not going to get anywhere. First off, they don't have the authority to be cutting things. Now, they've got the bully pulpit. They could put a spotlight on things. But when you're done, what is it? 2/3 of the budget is mandatory spending? So at best, if they could do everything they wanted to do, they still couldn't cut enough to balance the budget.
No, still couldn't balance the budget. If they could do everything they wanted to do and cut defense spending 100%, they probably still couldn't do what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
That is an insoluble problem given the inputs that we now have. The only way to solve this problem before it torpedoes us as a country is to change the inputs. It's the only way. And that will never happen. And people can draw whatever conclusion they want from what I just said.
This is a good point to plug the plan that you and I float every couple of years when we hit the budget deficit ceiling. There is a way to wean us off of Social Security without current retirees falling through the cracks, without raising the payroll tax, without cutting benefits, and that leaves the government actually at a surplus at the end of the whole process. The problem is it requires Congress sticking to a plan for the next 100 years.
Yeah, that's right. The process is 100 years long, which is never going to happen. Everybody wants this to be fixed right now, and the problem has become so profound that there is no way to fix it right now. It is literally impossible.
Oh no, it took a century to get here. It's going to take another century to fix it.
And, we've been talking about this plan for 6-8 years now, which means necessarily that the numbers we attached to it 6 or 8 years ago are no longer the numbers we would need.
Yeah, the longer we wait, the more difficult the problem becomes.
And the more difficult it becomes, the less likely we ever are to address it. And I'm already willing to say the odds of our addressing this problem are 0%.
Yeah, politically, yes. There's a way to do it economically, but politically, yes. I think the odds are virtually zero. Now, where does that leave us? I could tell you. I'll predict it right now. I've made this prediction several times over the past 15 years that we've been working together, but I've now reached the point that enough has happened that I can say with near certainty, this is where we're going. Where we're going is monetization. We're going to just print the money that we need, and it's going to mean that we have our background inflation that used to be 1.5% to 2% is going to be 5 to 7%. Starting a decade from now, that's going to be the new normal.
I'm going to go steps further than you just did because, yes, that's going to happen first. And then inflation will set in, and we will have to monetize more and more and more because that's the pernicious effect of inflation. Right? Everything just gets out of hand. And before you know it, we're going to have an economy that is indistinguishable from Venezuela's. And when the dollar collapses and has no value, the United States will cease to exist as a country.
Yeah, see, and I'm not going to go there because I think this is where the politics comes to play. Americans have exhibited, the voters have exhibited that they have a tolerance for the debt. Yeah, they squeal about it, but they don't vote people out of office because of it. But this past business with the inflation in 2022, 2023, the voters indicated that they have no tolerance for inflation like that. And I think that's when the political pressure comes to bear.
Look, that's right. But what does the political pressure against inflation yield? And it yields pain in every way imaginable. And they don't like that either. So they're going to be given two choices that are equally unpalatable, and they will just go on blaming. Large groups of people will blame the opposite party until the whole thing comes crashing down.
I think this is a little bit different in that the inflation hits everybody. And all of a sudden, everybody's feeling this pain. Now, if you're a retiree, maybe, okay, yes, I'm feeling this pain, but I don't want you to cut my benefits. But everybody else is saying, look, this is a tremendous amount of pain. Yeah, we're going to have to cut benefits.
Right. And then what happens?
Well, we cut benefits because the people paying in are going to be outweighing the people who are receiving.
By then, Social Security will come crashing down. It will cease to exist as a program. If it exists at all, it will be meaningless.
Well, that solves your problem right there. If that shuts down, that balances the budget.
That solves a problem. It doesn't solve the problem, right? The problem is profligate spending. And that is going to come home to roost in 100 different ways.
Yeah, and let me say something here. I ran these numbers maybe a decade ago, and I've run them a couple times, and they're telling every time. When we talk about the deficit, someone always comes back to me and says, well, look, we've just got to bite the bullet and raise taxes. And if you look historically, every time the government has received more tax revenue, in the following year, it spends 25% more than that. So for every additional dollar it gets, a year later, it spends an additional $1.25.
The only way to get around this is a constitutional amendment that freezes spending to increases to GDP.
Right, yes.
And that causes all manner of problems, right? What if war breaks out? What if there are tremendous natural disasters? So, okay, now you say it has to be a constitutional amendment with a footnote, but then trust me, everything will be a war or a disaster. There's no way to keep politicians from spending more than they take in.
They'll be declaring a national emergency to keep the mall open in Washington.
That's right. The only way to do it is to vote them out of office. And that's never going to happen because that violates the self-interest of the voters.
Well, but I repeated to somebody recently what you had said, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but when I repeated it, I thought, oh my God, this is the answer. It's to say any member of Congress who votes for an unbalanced budget cannot run for re-election.
No, should go to prison.
That's even better.
You want to stop them from doing it, stop them from doing it. You can write that in right now. How important are the wars going to be? How important is that flood going to be? You're going to take a sober analysis of things, because if the war is that important, go ahead and vote for it. Be to the prison on Monday. Who's your successor? Right? Let's get this done. And I think that actually would answer the problem. But nothing short of that ever would. Because you tell them that they can't run again, okay, I'll retire with my pension and I'll just be happy. What good does that do? But, as long as the American people see it in their heart to keep bringing morons like Michelle Taylor Greene and Lorena Boebert, as long as these fools are still in Congress, you can expect foolish legislation. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.